Okay, so from our outlook on internet connectivity and our outlook on data center market, we now go to the cloud market with Gregor Petri. He's the Vice President of Research at Gartner. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Gregor Petri.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, and I see some people coming in. There's still places available here, and if you leave, please do so accordingly. Yeah, there's space over here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, a little bit of the thunder already has been stolen because concentration is the thing. We do see that the big are getting bigger, and as a result, we see that a lot of the growth is with the big, and you saw that back in my presentation. However, if we look at the term of regulation, deregulation might actually address that. The UK regulator for the finance industry was the first one who said that the customers have to worry about concentration risk. And what they mean with that is that, of course, the financial regulator makes sure that banks don't become too big to fail. Well, guess what if all these banks are on a cloud and that cloud is too big to fail? So we are now seeing regulators which are directly impacting the growth of these large companies, saying they're becoming too big, and that might be one of the trends which actually is going to shape 2019 and make 2019 different from just an on-ramp to 2020. Because 2020 is a nice round number, so a lot of people think about 2019 as the way to get to 2020. Well, there might be some things that actually happen on the way. And I will talk about that from a cloud perspective. And to understand the future, we can't forget about the past. Let's hope that in the UK they do the same today. I'm going to look at just a little bit back around 2011, which happened to be the time that I joined Gartner, to talk about the cloud. At that moment, I was one of a group of about 10 analysts who were specifically covering the cloud. I'm now part of a group of about 2,000 analysts, which are all in some way, shape or form are looking at cloud. And the 10 original guys are figuring out, okay, what's next? And I'll talk a little bit also about what's next. So let's look at how 2018 looked from an enterprise perspective. This was where most IT teams were hanging out in 2011. So they were looking at their core systems, which had been around for a long time. They were just trying to get some breath after implementing ERP, often for the third time. The first time was distributed. The second time, at least, they had less modifications. And the third time, they all moved to one entity. So there was enormous investments done in this backbone. Investments we're still benefiting from today. CRM was the hot thing that was growing very fast, still is pretty hot. The biggest, however, investment area was analytics and BI, and guess what? We're still looking at analytics and BI as one of the main things, and we were slow in getting to grips with the idea that data was quite important. And then in a fairly short time, a number of things happened. We started talking about something called the Nexus. Maybe some of you remember it. Some others in the market called it SMAC, Social, Mobile, Analytics and Cloud. And what it meant was that the inward-focused viewpoint of IT was rapidly changing into a much more outward-focused. Social was all about interacting with your customers, with consumers. Data all of a sudden became big data and had a value of its own. It wasn't just something you had to feed the applications with in order to make them work. Data had its own economy, had its own value. Mobile was all the rage. Mobile first was coming out. And then, of course, this cloud thing. At the same time, we started making a lot more connections between the internal systems and the physical world. So call it operational technology, call it Internet of Things. But all of a sudden, we were connecting the digital world with the operational world and with things which were actually happening out there. And the thing was that things happened out there much faster than they happened on your screen. So all of a sudden, lower latency was becoming more and more important. And then the third part was that as we moved applications outside of the enterprise, we started to get a strange phenomena where applications were no longer run by the enterprise. Enterprises were participating in an application. And the term we used for that was ecosystems. So all of a sudden we saw these ecosystems, some others call it platform companies or platform models. The idea is the same. Instead of everyone having its own application and managing its own processes, you're now part of a bigger thing. You're a small cog in a big machine, and the machine is determining what is happening, and the machine goes across multiple players. Now, the most well-known examples are, of course, more in the consumer space, things like Uber. Uber isn't a taxi company. There's thousands and thousands of taxi drivers and taxi companies, and they're all participating in the same system. Airbnb is another one, but we're now also seeing this in the more industrial supply chains, where companies are no longer running their own destiny, but they're participating in somebody else's game. And what we're also seeing is that these providers of these platforms, even if they don't have cars or they don't have hotel rooms or whatever, they don't have the assets, but they determine what's happening in the market. A very strange phenomena. Now, I'm absolutely sure that all of you are much more interested in what was the impact of that on the data center. So the center of gravity for the enterprise changed, the viewpoint changed, but what's the impact for the data center? Well, the impact is quite severe. What we're seeing is that the data center of the future is no longer a place. It's no longer a building. It's for sure it's no longer in the basement. If anywhere, it's on the first floor, so it doesn't get flooded with the first flood. It's always on. There are no maintenance windows anymore. So you can't plan for, okay, during the weekend, probably everyone is off and we can do a refurbishment or we can do an upgrade or things like that. It's instantly available. So we don't have to do a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan or even a week plan. We can get the capacity when we need it. It's adaptable. We don't even need to know what type of applications we're going to run in there, whether they're memory intensive or storage intensive. We want to be able to change that on the fly. It's service based. Basically, these other things I mentioned are only possible if you don't run it as a physical asset yourself, but if you consume it as a service and put the burden of figuring out what is needed when and how onto somebody else. And that's exactly what the cloud providers are doing. And of course, they're shifting that burden then to the colo providers, saying, well, also I want to be able to have this flexibility where possible to be able to change very, very quickly. Latency is becoming a big part of it because things are becoming more real time and we want to move faster. And for one thing is for sure, it's not going to be owned or even managed and run by the internal enterprise IT teams. It might not even be owned by the enterprise. It will be owned by this new industry, which we call the cloud industry. So there's quite a lot happening. We're going to talk about it in 3 parts. In the next 12 minutes, we're going to talk about, okay, what are the dynamics in the market? I already gave away a bit of a spoiler. It's concentrating. How is the usage within enterprises changing? And where are the opportunities? We estimate that now about 70 to 90% of enterprises are using cloud in some way, shape or form, and not just in a rogue fashion where somebody did something he wasn't supposed to do, but where it's actually part of the strategy of the company, and it's in the plans for the future to use more cloud. But we're also seeing this idea of multi-cloud growing, not just from these regulators saying avoid concentration risks, but also enterprises gotten burdened in the past, figuring out, okay, it's not a good idea to be completely dependent on one vendor, so let's spread our risk a little bit, let's use something from this cloud vendor, something from that cloud vendor, and you of course know what the immediate outcome of that is, and that is integration issues. The minute you start using more than one, the burden of having them work together comes back to you, and that is where we see a lot of the investments happening at the moment. We see most of the cloud growth at this moment still coming from new applications. So if you look at all these fast-growing cloud companies, it's not because they're running stuff that used to run in an enterprise data center. It's more that they're running stuff for enterprises that these enterprises didn't have before. However, we now see this migration wave starting to come. Migration is a bit of a two-edged sword. I'll talk about it a little bit more. But it for sure isn't the thing which is going to really power the market. What is powering the market is demand for new applications which do things faster, more graphical, more real-time, more 3D than they did it in the past. and especially things like artificial intelligence, serverless computing, IoT. So the big growth still is coming from stuff we didn't do before. It's not just moving stuff around and hoping it will be 2 cents cheaper on the dollar. And public cloud is now the preferred model. So for a long time, we saw that, for instance, banks and governments would say, public cloud. I'd like the idea and the concept of cloud, but I would like to do it myself, which kind of puts the saw at the bottom of the thing, which is called this service model. If you're servicing yourself, that's like, okay, we got dinner as a service at home. I can say that, but the provider of that won't agree with that, even if it's myself. So if you really want a service model, you have to have different players in there to do so. And then another interesting thing we see starting to evolve is that things like private cloud and on-premise cloud, and the combination of public and private cloud called hybrid cloud, and edge cloud are no longer competitors to the public cloud. They are becoming an extension to the public cloud. So the public cloud is what determines the direction, and when we use the public cloud, we might use some stuff we might need some stuff on premise. We might need some stuff closer to the end user, near to the edge of the network. And they're being deployed, but they're being deployed in the context of public cloud. So public cloud is a very important determination factor for the strategy and the direction that things are taking, and it's not an alternative. On-ramps to the cloud, lots of R's here. I always find the most interesting one, the reimagine. So let's think about our business, let's think about our customers, and how would we serve them if we had nothing at all at this moment? What would the world look like? Then you get to ideas like Uber, you get to ideas like Airbnb, etc. A completely new business model, a new way to make money, and it comes with applications, typically a platform, and how do we deploy that? So that's at the top of the stack, very important part of the cloud market. Then there's the releasing or relinquishing, where we say, well, okay, we used to do this, we used to run our own canteen, we used to have our own trucks to do the distribution to customers. We're no longer going to do that, we're going to have a third party do that. We're relinquishing it to somebody else. Replacing applications. We used to have a bookkeeping application or an ERP system even, and we're deciding we're now going to consume that. CRM, travel management, expense management. A lot of these systems which are being replaced are more in the periphery of the core systems, and I'll talk about why. Let's talk about that now. The reason is that what we see happening at the moment is that IT is moving from a secondary, a support system, aka overhead, into a primary system, aka direct cost. And at the same time, what we see is that companies are saying, okay, we want to distinguish between the systems which are our primary activities, which are our core businesses, those we want to own, not in a separate support system which is called IT, but internally, the guy who runs whatever market, he is also responsible for the digital activity in that market, and thus he's responsible for the applications in that market. We see more and more end users appointing product managers which are going to manage these applications. And these product managers very often are business people, they're not IT people, they know IT, they got support from IT, but it's the business people who run them. And for those systems where we say, well, actually, that's not our core business, we just consume them, that is where we see a lot of software as a service being consumed. And then we get into the rebuild and the refactor, where we take the existing applications and we make them ready to become a direct system, a direct application. And sometimes we also just build from scratch. So we create a completely new system. And then there's some rehosting, the lift and shift, where we do fairly little about it. We also see a lot of retain, where they just keep it where it is for now, until it gets even a little bit smaller, a little bit less important, and then we'll worry about replacing it. And a number of these systems which are staying in place now, the main trigger to be moved eventually is that they're the only ones left in the company data center. So at a certain moment, these last remaining systems will be the only ones running there, and as a result, they will have to bear the full cost of the building, of the cooling, of the air conditioning, of the energy, and that will be the time they get moved out. So not because this application is getting old or because the cloud is getting better, but basically because they got all these overhead costs to carry. End result of this, the cloud market will grow. The bottom graph is the most interesting one that shows the new dollars. This is in constant currency, so we took out the currency effects of this. The new dollars entering the market. So this growth opportunity for providers who step in there, which in 2022 will be something like 37 billion entering the market. If we look at the markets, what we see there is, first of all, the dark blue part is the market share of the top 10. And in some cases, actually, the largest part of the dark blue part is taken by the top 2 or the top 3. So there we see that concentration risk. And what we see at the bottom for infrastructure, platform, and software as a service, we see that the top 10 vendors are growing much faster than the rest of the market. So the concentration is getting bigger. We're going to see more we're going to see a very few very big vendors who have a very large part of the market, which means that all the other vendors who are not within the top 2, top 3 of a certain market have to rethink what will I become when I'm no longer a provider myself? How can I survive? What market should I move into? And I'll talk about that. Let's look at the top 3. So what we see, or the top 10 in the different industries, what we see there is infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. If we look at the markets individually, we see that the North American one, you can see that by the size of the bubbles at the top, is still very, very big. Europe is basically the only one which comes a little bit close. And as a result, what we see is that the adoption rate of cloud overtaking the traditional systems is going very, very fast in North America. With the red arrow, you see that that's happening this year. In Europe, we see it happening by the end of our time horizon. I talked about this concentration risk. This is what we call cloud shift. We see that in all the industries, basically the part that is cloud becomes bigger and bigger, but it's still less than half. It's significantly less than half in most markets. We also see the types of services that are used being changed. We see that back in our inquiries. We get different questions. And a lot of the questions are about management. How do I manage that? And we see 11 different categories of management. Security being a very important one of that. And that is where a lot of the newcomers and the new initiatives will come. They won't be direct cloud. They will be cloud management companies. And I mentioned, okay, where do you go then to grow that? Well, that is in the additional services, the consulting around it. This is my last slide, and it shows the opportunities. And what you see at the bottom in dark blue, those are the cloud services. Healthy growth, healthy profitability, sizable markets. The light blue ones are the adjacent markets. Cloud consulting, cloud implementation, managed cloud services. Not providing your own cloud services, not competing with Amazon or Azure or Google, but basically offering services on top of that, and that is where the interesting bit of the market will sit. With that, we got about 1 minute for questions, I think.
Thank you very much, Gregor Petri, for and thank you for sticking to the time. The slides will be made available online, and you're also available here at the conference to talk to. We have time for one question over here. Eric, could you provide a microphone?
Thank you. For hybrid cloud adoption, enterprise adoption, which industry verticals are ahead of others in Europe, and which cities or countries in Europe are ahead of others in hybrid cloud adoption?
UK traditionally was first. Nordics and Netherlands are catching up. The rest is on a steady state. We see that a number of countries like Germany for a long time was very reluctant to implement cloud, but they're catching up now, are getting more open to that. If we look at the industries, the media industry was clearly the leading one in the cloud. And what we now see coming is the financial industry is catching up. They, for a long time, thought they had to do private cloud. Now they got around to this idea we're not going to be able to do private cloud as good as the public cloud guys, but they're running into this challenge of the regulator saying, yeah, but don't become too dependent on one cloud provider.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gregor Petri from Gartner, and hope to see you back next year too. Yeah, you can take the Outlook report with you. So our final keynote will be about the data economy. Jürgen Gren is expert in the cabinet of the Vice President ANSIP at the European Commission. digital single market, and you're already here. You have no slides, I assume. You have your paper with you. Okay, please take it away. Jürgen.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I will just turn this off, perhaps. So thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. Now, the questions I work for the Vice President of the European Commission, Mr. Andrus Ansip, and he's a former Prime Minister of Estonia. I'm his political advisor, and I'm responsible for the digital single market. And apparently I'm the only guy here with a tie. So I'm also the only guy without a PowerPoint presentation. But I'll try to do it as vividly as I possibly can. But I'm a bureaucrat, so you have to bear with me a little bit, okay? So the questions I wanted to touch upon here are twofold. So where are we today with the digital single market? And what are the challenges in the medium term which are relevant for policymakers? Here you've been speaking about the challenges for you, for the industry. But what I wanted to touch upon are the challenges, strategic challenges, if you will, for the policymaker. So just a caveat here, perhaps. It's very difficult for me to second guess what the next commission will do, because I'm talking about medium-term development, so in 5-10 years' time. And I also work for a vice president who really wants results. So the digital single market, which has been put on the table now for the past 4 years, he wants it to be finalized. But of course, a few personal pointers are always possible. Now, what have we achieved so far? I think that we've achieved quite a lot. The digital single market is almost as a big bang as the 1992 analog single market. We aimed at 3 things at the time, 4 years ago: to update the traditional or the normal single market to the online environment, to add a digital dimension to the EU's 4 basic freedoms, and to make it easier for people and businesses to exercise online activities in fair competition and with a level playing field. I think we've achieved all of these different objectives by putting around 30 legislative proposals on the table. Today we have achieved decisions with the Parliament and the Council in 23 of these 30. I know that in your business time goes very fast. In my business, 4 years for achieving 23 legislative proposals is a bloody world record, I can tell you this. This takes time. We have to get all the commissioners to agree, we have to get 28 member states to agree, we have to get 750 parliamentarians to agree. So I'm telling you, 23 out of 30 fundamental type of decisions, which goes to the very heart of the changes of the economy, is a world record. I give you a few examples. The GDPR, it doesn't need any presentation here. It's the gold standard in the world today for data protection and privacy. The end of roaming surcharges. We have very tangible results on this. In the first year after we stopped the roaming surcharges, the data use increased in the European Economic Area with around 435%. So people, we all here, are no longer afraid of our phones. It's a simple thing, but it's quite important. End of unjustified geo-blocking. It's applicable from December last year, so just about a month ago. So now vendors can no longer prevent people from buying services or products online just because they come from a different country. They can't use, if you will, the IP addresses or the credit card or the nationality to prevent you from making purchases online. Another thing which is quite close to my heart is the cross-border portability of content, which I was responsible for in particular, which means that you can take with you anywhere you go in Europe your subscription to the TV. This is quite important. Young people like it. They don't like lock-in. Young people like people here, of course, or even younger perhaps. They like it because they want to take the subscriptions with them when they travel. And for me, of course, I'm a fan of IFK Göteborg, which is, I'm Swedish, so this is football for me. It's quite important, and it's quite important for a lot of people. So you can bring this with you now. Before you couldn't due to copyright restrictions. Today you can. These are very tangible results. And I wanted to just finish on the digital single market, what we achieved so far with the free flow of data. This is something that is very important for you. This regulation starts to apply in May this year. and it is now prohibited to put in place national laws that force data localizations to one specific country in the EU. This is a little bit of a silent revolution, I would think. EU is the first in the world to have this kind of rule. It has not attracted as much attention as copyright. You see this weird picture of me up there. This is the picture which comes from a very nasty article which was on, because I'm responsible for copyright, it says this man wants to destroy the internet. So they used this picture. I don't know why you actually used this picture, but this is the picture which has been spread most about me, because I'm the guy who wants to destroy internet by dealing with copyright. But this free flow of data has happened a little bit under the radar, and I thought I'd highlight this for you. But we also have many other major initiatives of these 30 in high performance computing, for instance, digital skills, net neutrality, cybersecurity, digitizing industry, and also e-government. And these last little lists that I told you represent some of the future-looking aspects in the digital single market, which brings me to the future challenges and a little bit what are we facing in medium term. Again, I don't want to second-guess the next commission, but there are 4 or 5 different things. For a policymaker, so bear that in mind, please, for a policymaker, it's not about technology development necessarily, but this is about policymakers. So the first challenge that we have is that digital transformation will simply continue. It's an evident transformation, and it is unstoppable. Industry 4.0 will simply happen, and digitization of businesses and industry will become a reality. Our strategy was to embrace this change and ensure that we remove barriers for consumers and businesses. And as I said, this transformation will simply complete itself, and it will be the case also for e-government and health services. But for a regulator point of view, what does this mean? It means that you have to design policy which concretely, tangibly, comes to grip with issues like once only principle. You only have to give your information digitally once to a state or an organization, and it then uses this. Tangible solutions on digital by default or digital by design, standardization, interoperability, or facilitated, what we call facilitated mutual recognition, which is what we used when we dealt with e-identity solutions across borders in the European Union, which is also now a reality. So this is what it means for a regulator, this evident transformation. For you, it's already clear. But for a regulator, it needs to transform this or translate this into actual decisions that make sense. The second challenge is, and you've touched upon this here today, is the unlimited need for broadband, bandwidth, and storage. The demand for the internet will simply grow endlessly, we think, as new services come online and mobile points will become mobile. We have in Europe a very superior infrastructure that has helped us to be attractive for many innovative businesses. And this means to try to continue this type of investment. So for a policymaker, again, this means higher investment in broadband, increased investment in all types of skills which come with a data-centric economy. It also means to succeed with 5G. Quite a few technological developments depend on this, like connected cars or the Internet of Things. The third challenge is, you talked about here as well, the person just preceding me talked about it as well, is a digital economy intermediated by platforms. It seems foreseeable that value chains will continuously be the subject of digital offerings by platforms, new digital offerings. And this provokes, of course, disintermediation of traditional actors. And this has clearly been the case for the consumer internet, where American actors has disintermediated very traditional European actors. And from our perspective, it's important to be careful about this and analyze this phenomenon also from the perspective of the industrial internet. And to this analysis should also be added, we think, the increasing power of web facilitators. So these are the actors, basically you here today, who provide the building blocks, cloud or web services that you need to engage in any kind of online activity. But from a policy-making point of view, is where you have a situation where very few companies, the concentration that you, from the person from Gartner just talked about, where few companies provide the nuts and bolts of digital services and cloud provision, it needs some reflection. I would be interested in view on this. Concentration is getting bigger. This does not necessarily mean new legislation, not necessarily, but it does mean, we think, that we should be starting looking at maybe new ways of how do we measure or what constitutes dominance. But it's an open question. The platforms today in the European Union are regulated by something called the e-commerce directive. The Vice President, my boss, will not put forward any new legislation in this field to change the e-commerce directive. But it's still worthwhile to mention it because, well, first of all, in there you have a principle which is the single market clause, which means a prohibition to restrict cross-border provision of information society services, a prohibition to restrict. And this is a keystone principle for the digital single market. But it was very clear, for me at least, is that the new Commission would need to look at this e-commerce directive, which is the fundamental law for how platforms work and operate inside the European Union. A rethink would probably be possible there or be needed. I can't foresee exactly what will happen, but I would think that the discussions will focus around liability. That would be my guess, but again, I can't foresee this completely. First challenge is how do we handle a data-centric economy? Again, this is quite banal stuff for you, but from a policymaker, we have to look at this from a variety of perspectives. The first perspective is that we need to open up for data. We have in the pipeline already today our Open Data Directive. It's called the PSI Directive, Public Sector Information, or the Open Data Directive. But there's still a debate ongoing, so we try to open up as much public data as possible for companies to use. This is weather data, this is business registers, it could be any kind of public data, transport data, for instance. We try to open up that as much as possible. But there's still an issue about private company data. Private company data. The issues here for a policymaker will be to look at things like access policies, data sharing, data ownership, liability for new services focusing on the Internet of Things is also linked to this data-centric challenge. So who is liable for self-driving cars, for instance? And I guess that this discussion will also continue in the future. Another thing which is related to data, of course, is the international data flows. We already have a variety of decisions with other partners, like in the US, for instance, but these kind of discussions, they are called adequacy decisions, are going on with other countries like South Korea, and we are looking potentially at India and Brazil as well. So we are working on these different areas. There are many more different challenges, but I'd just like to mention another one which is about trust. The Vice President Ansip, when he started his career in the Commission, when he started, he had an interview with the European Parliament, or is like more of a panel, if you will, or the whole Parliament asking questions to see whether he was fit for having his job. And he said there that for the digital economy, trust is a must. And this still holds true. It's trust that your Wi-Fi is safe, trust that your connected objects are safe, trust that your data centers are secure, for instance. The current almost daily influx of bad digital news doesn't really help. Social media, for instance. How this will develop is a little bit less clear for me. Maybe we're going towards a situation where people and businesses are afraid of handing out data. Maybe people will start preferring to pay for services instead of getting it for free. Maybe businesses would prefer services with very effective end-to-end controls, a much stronger handle on their data. This is a very strong possibility. For regulators, this means a couple of things. Continued focus on cybersecurity, but also a strategic level reflection on the dependency of European companies on foreign supply chain companies. One of the former speakers actually mentioned this. For regulators, this also means to be clear what technology can and cannot do. For instance, in terms of ethical boundaries for artificial intelligence. We are currently working on guidelines for AI ethics, and we have an expert group who is working on this and published the guidelines quite recently, and they will finalize their work in the European AI Alliance. Several of you here are probably members of this. They will publish the final document in March. But businesses need to be able to invest knowing what the limits are. Just use the high potential of health data, for instance. If the trust in the ethical and social implications of artificial intelligence is not there, then the investments in health data or health sector will simply not happen. The final challenge is about investment. And we have to go back a couple of years in time. Some of you were there at the time. In the early 90s, we had a productivity gap with the US, which was widened. Why? Because the investments were made in IT in the US, but not in the EU. And why was this? If you read a little bit about this area or this time, what I found interesting to see was that the reason for why Europe didn't invest in IT at the time was that the skills of the managers were not there. They didn't understand that IT was important, therefore they didn't invest. And we speak a lot about skills in general, but normally, or usually, we relate to the skills of the people, the labor, the workers. But perhaps we should be looking at the IT skills of the managers instead, and this is something that your industry, of course, knows a thing or two about. So for the regulators, this means offensive policies, to invest in R&D policies, to invest in upgrading of skills. For the EU where I work, it means turning our investment programs toward digital investments. We are now discussing the new financial program for the next 7 years. And what we want from the Vice President's side is, of course, to have a very strong digital investment. But it's not up to us. We propose, the Member States and the Parliament decides. We want digital investment. So we want to ensure that the full data innovation chain, from free flow of data, high performance computing, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, etc., are well funded in the face of international competition. All of these are very difficult challenges, but I believe that we have touched upon most of these, at least in the beginning of these, in the digital single market. And we hope that the digital single market, once it becomes functional, should help to Europe to seize on these challenges confidently. So again, and I'll end here, thanks for the invitation. And let's not forget how much our digital single market projects has achieved already. I mention this because without removing barriers that prevent digital growth, without the right legal environment, and without adequate investment, I think Europe will not have much of a digital future. But thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Jürgen Gren. Are you open for some questions, perhaps? Yes, there's a question over there. Eric, by here, yes.
Yes, so recent events suggest that maybe the regulation around data ownership was overdue, in the same way that GDPR was a leadership position for Europe. I'm wondering if you anticipate that ownership of data regulation coming sooner rather than later, and kind of what that might look like in terms of a framework that would be a best practice.
This is very difficult to say. We're not there yet. I mean, this is a very tricky area, because I think we need to, as always, the policymakers, when we take decisions, this is something which affects 500 million, or at least today, 500 million citizens, and I don't know how many million businesses. So we have to be very careful. And ownership of data as an IP right, for instance, it's a tricky proposition. And we really need to know what we're doing. I mean, there are so many different sides to this story. In the car manufacturing sector, for instance, you have one side. The car manufacturer wants to have complete ownership of the data, but then you have the providers of services to the car manufacturers who see that they will go out of business if there's a strong IP right of ownership of data, etc. And the car manufacturer says, yes, but if we don't have IP rights or ownership of data, then a couple of 3 or 4, should we say, very gigantic companies around the world would just be able to hoover up this data and use it for their own purposes and put us out of business. So these are the different aspects on data ownership that we really need to look at. And we started to mention the issue of data ownerships in the communication from 2 years back, the data economy communication, which I was a part of the team who wrote. And to be honest, I don't think we have the answers now, but I think we need to look at things of data access, sharing data, and potentially also ownership of data. But as I said, again, I can't foresee exactly what the Commission is doing, but I'm pretty sure that this issue would be on the table for discussions, for analysis, etc. for decision, I can't say.